Chapter 22. It couldn't end any other way. Jake had known that from the moment he'd met Rachel 3 years ago in the Polecat General Store. He'd known it and he'd fought the attraction until finally he couldn't fight it anymore. And now they'd come to this: last kisses, last touches, last words murmured in the silky half-light of Alaska's midnight sun. They undressed each other, slowly peeling back layers of clothing to stroke skin heated by a desire that would leave each of them burning for days, weeks, perhaps the rest of their lives. But the hunter's arrival, right when he was struggling with his feelings for Rachel, had an inevitability about it. They were supposed to come and give him a reason to leave her. But he wasn't leaving yet, and her long lithe body beckoned to him. Once all her clothes were gone, she stretched out on the bed and opened her arms. Jake silently accepted her invitation. Gliding over her, he breathed in the intoxicating scent that had beguiled him from that first day. Lying beneath him, touched by the golden light from the bedside lamp, she was more beautiful than he ever could have imagined on that fateful day 3 years ago. He'd fantasized about her for 3 long years, but nothing he'd imagined had been as potent as the woman herself. He knew she would haunt his dreams for a very long time, but his path was set, and it didn't include her. That was better for both of them. Still, his heart wept at the thought of leaving her. Leaning down to kiss her eyes, her cheeks, and her lips, he murmured his thanks for all she'd given him. She'd allowed him to love her, and she'd willingly accepted the limits he'd placed on that loving. While he'd had limits, she'd had none. If he asked her to go with him, she would. She'd put up with the disapproval of werewolves like Ann and Bruce just to be by his side. If he didn't ask, and he wouldn't, then she would let him go without a single word of protest. She was a proud woman, and he cherished that about her. "I'll miss touching you here," he murmured as he brushed his mouth over the hollow of her throat. "And here." He pressed his lips to her full breast, right above her heart. He could feel it beating as he nuzzled her velvety skin and tugged on the firm peak of her nipple. Each caress made her heart beat faster. She spoke his name on a sigh, then drew in a long, quivering breath and shuddered beneath him. Returning to her lips, he drank the sweetness of her exhale. Her eyes remained closed, as if she couldn't bear to watch their story end. Or maybe she didn't want him to see the sadness in those stormy depths. So he wouldn't ask her to look at him. If she wanted to hide, he understood. Trembling with the need to sink into her, he nevertheless held back. No one had ever welcomed him the way she did, and he suspected no one ever would. Again, he wanted to take his time. "And I'll miss this most of all," he said. Gently he probed her moist center with the blunt tip of his cock, but he resisted the urge to push forward. "I love the anticipation right before I thrust, when I'm balanced above you and your heat reaches out to me. Your scent drives me crazy right now, but I'm going to wait." Her eyelids fluttered and she moaned. "I'm going to wait so that I can admire the flush on your cheeks. Now it's moved to your breasts, and your nipples have tightened even more. Your skin is glowing with a special sheen like early morning dew." With a soft whimper of need, she moved restlessly beneath him. "Soon, very soon. But this is my favorite moment of making love to you, and I don't want to rush it. Not tonight. My climax is a wonderful moment too, and yours is even better, but this is the best right now before it all begins." Her eyelids lifted, and he sucked in a breath. Instead of being shadowed with misery, her silvery eyes blazed with light. Cradling his face in both hands, she locked her gaze with his. "That's the most beautiful speech I've ever heard. I meant every word of it. I could tell. And here's my response. I love you, Jake Hunter." She said the words clearly, as if she didn't want him to misunderstand. There was no request buried in those words, no expectation lurking in those magnificent eyes. "I thought you should know." He was humbled by her courage. Declaring her love now when she knew it was overtook guts. But it didn't surprise him. Her next words did. "And you love me." She said it with the same strong conviction. "But you don't want to tell me because you think it makes no sense to say you love someone when you're leaving for Idaho." His heart ached. "How come you're so smart? It doesn't take a genius. You aren't willing to lay down your fortune and your life for some person you sort of care about. No. You may not think you can say the words, but your actions are pretty darned obvious." The thing is, you can love me and still go to Idaho. They're not mutually exclusive. He looked into those amazing eyes of hers for several long seconds and wondered how in the hell he would leave her tomorrow. I do love you, he said softly. And you're right. I didn't think I could say it. But see? It's okay. You can. So I can. Joy poured through him at being able to speak the words that had been hammering at his heart. I love you, Rachel Miller. And he drove deep, with a groan of pure happiness. Told you so. What followed was an enthusiastic bout of wild, loud, and celebratory sex. Jake lost count of how many times he told Rachel he loved her. He even lost count of how many orgasms she had, but it was quite a few. When he finally came and they collapsed in a sweaty heap, she rocked him in her arms while she crooned I love you, Jake Hunter over and over. But at last, she nestled quietly in his arms and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed and she sighed in obvious contentment. Jake's heart ached more than he'd ever thought possible. He wanted to hold her tight and never let her go, but that was not to be. In his agony, his soul sent out a message. I'll love you forever, Rachel, and no one will ever take your place in my heart. Her eyes fluttered open and she gazed up at him. There will be no one else. For me either, Jake. He went very still. What did you say? No one will take your place in my heart either. Just like you said to me. But I didn't say anything. She frowned. Yes, you did. I heard you distinctly. I was starting to drift off to sleep and then you said, I only thought it, Rachel. His throat went dry and his heart began to pound. I didn't say it out loud. Somehow you heard what I thought. She didn't seem particularly impressed with that information. I would believe that. It was sort of the way I could hear you when you were in wolf form. You don't understand. As a wolf, I can mentally communicate with wolves and other wild creatures. Amazingly, I was able to communicate with you too. After I shifted, which I'm pretty sure is rare. But I have never been able to form that same mental link when I'm in human form. Not with words or with humans. I've never heard of any werewolf who could. You look a little freaked out about it, Jake. Is it a problem? He tried to get a handle on what had just happened. Not a problem exactly, but definitely a phenomenon. I'm not surprised that I can hear your thoughts, no matter what form you take. She stroked his face. I've never bonded with anyone the way I have with you. Same here. Dazed as he was by this discovery, he had to know if it went both ways. Let's test this. I want you to try and send me a message. Not about us. Or anything I would guess easily. Make it more of a challenge. Okay. She focused her gaze on his. And he heard Ted desperately needs to find a girlfriend. Jake repeated the message he'd heard. That's it. Word for word. My God. Jake looked at her in amazement. This could make werewolf history. But no one will ever find out about it. Oh well. Is that true? Does Ted need a girlfriend? Oh, Jake, he does. He puts up a good front, but he's lonely. I'm going to get him signed up for one of the dating sites after you leave. Good. But I'd rather not think about the leaving part if you don't mind. I don't want to either, but after you move to Idaho we'll be able to communicate with each other and no one will ever know. Isn't that cool? Yeah. He leaned over and kissed her because he didn't want to dim the sparkle of excitement in her eyes. It's very cool. But he wondered if this was more of a curse than a blessing. The temptation to keep in touch this way would be constant. And yet, if it was all they had, if they could never hold each other, never share their laughter and tears, then what was that mental connection worth? For their own sanity they might have to give it up. But in the meantime she was still here, and her kisses made him forget that she wouldn't always be with him. Seeking oblivion, he melted into her. They didn't sleep much that night, which was how Rachel wanted it. Buying a pound of coffee the night before had turned into a 3-act play. After all that she'd gone through to get the coffee, they might as well make use of it to counteract their lack of sleep. Loving Jake was far more important than getting a good night's rest anyway. They showered together, which involved more sex, but once they were dressed, the mood shifted. Rachel knew they wouldn't be getting naked again, and that meant the goodbye scene was coming up soon. She went into survival mode. Jake contacted the hunters to let them know he'd made his decision and he'd be over at his place within the next hour, because Rachel needed something to do. While he made that call, she threw together an omelet to go with the coffee she'd brewed. All the blinds were up now because they had nothing to be secretive about. When Jake made his call to the hunters out on her deck, she was able to sneak glances at him while he talked. He still looked tense, which was a shame if he was about to live his dream. When he came back in, he seemed surprised to see food on the table, but covered his amazement quickly. Terrific, Rachel. Thanks for fixing breakfast. You didn't think I could, did you? His smile was apologetic. I didn't, but you kept telling me you weren't much of a cook. I'm not, but I have to feed myself and I can't exist totally on candy bars, so I've mastered a few basics. Go ahead and sit down. I'll bring you some coffee. Okay, thanks. Although her nerves were stretched tight, she congratulated herself on behaving like a relatively sane person. That was until she almost poured the coffee down the drain instead of carrying it into the dining area. Maybe she wasn't as cool about this as she liked to think she was. But Jake wouldn't have to know that. She'd stopped herself before dumping the coffee in the sink, so she carried it out of the kitchen and poured each of them a steaming mug. Smells great. Thanks. She returned the pot to the kitchen and came back to sit at the table with him. Is it a burden dealing with a super nose? He laughed, which was her intention. She didn't want to let the mood dip all the way into gloom and doom. I don't think of it that way, he said. But I'm used to it. But you haven't had that ability all your life, right? Because if you had, that would be a clue that someone had been born were. He put down his coffee and gazed at her. Good observation. You're absolutely right. Until young werewolves hit puberty, their senses aren't any more developed than a human's. That's too bad in a way. She dug into her omelet, which wasn't half bad if she did say so. If they showed that tendency earlier, wouldn't that help sort things out? Maybe for the mixed species couples, but think about it. A baby is enough of a challenge. What if you had to worry about whether your little baby girl would suddenly turn into a wolf cub as you pushed a buggy through Central Park? Then what? I see how that might be a problem. But if the werewolf tendencies showed up slightly sooner than puberty, that would take the mystery out of situations like the Wallace brothers have. His green gaze sharpened. You got pretty far into McDowell's book, I see. Couldn't help it, Jake. With an imagination like mine, how could I resist something as exotic as rich werewolves? Is it true that Wallace Enterprises owns the Chrysler Building? I believe so. It's through a dummy corporation, but that sounds right. The Wallaces have major holdings in New York. Howard Wallace was elected president of the Were Council last fall in Denver. And yet both of his sons have mated with humans. I find that amazing. Jake sighed. I find it depressing. Don't Aidan and Rourke understand that? They're Wallaces. It's the proudest werewolf name in North America, and they behave as if they have no sense of tradition or solidarity. Apparently they fell in love. The minute she said it, she wished she hadn't. Last night had been all about the love between her and Jake, and that statement might make him think she wanted to use that love as an excuse to defy tradition. I didn't mean that the way it sounded. I know. He pushed away his plate, even though he'd eaten only half of his omelet. The Wallace brothers are a sore spot for me. I grew up hearing about the mighty Wallace dynasty from my mother. I could hardly wait to meet members of the Wallace pack because I just knew we'd hit it off and share common values. Not so much Jake. She shouldn't say anything, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. I'm trying not to take offense, but you're sitting at the table with a member of the other species, the one you so object to the Wallace brothers taking up with. He glanced at her and had the decency to look embarrassed. You're right. Apologize. The mood was permanently ruined now. Maybe that was just as well. Anger at his attitude could keep her from feeling the pain when he left. It's probably time for me to drive you over to your cabin so you can rendezvous with the hunters. I'll help you with the dishes first. Never mind the dishes, Jake. Let's get this over with. That was harsh, but damn it, every word out of his mouth since they'd sat down to breakfast had made her feel like a second-class citizen. She wouldn't tolerate that, not even from the one she loved. Jake took the hint and left the dishes. The trip over to his cabin was made in silence, a heartbreaking contrast to the closeness they'd felt all through the night. But Rachel felt Jake moving away from her and closer to his new pack. They wouldn't want him to have close ties to a human female. Jake might choose to give up that little mental telepathy trick they discovered last night. The hunter's SUV was parked in front of Jake's cabin when they arrived, and that irritated Rachel even more. They were too blasted eager in her estimation. Jake had lived in Polecat for many years, and they seemed ready to pluck him out of there as if he had no roots in the community. So maybe it was a human community and not one of their precious were packs. Rachel realized her attitude was deteriorating rapidly, but the sight of that black SUV sitting in front of Jake's cabin got her back up. They had to know. She'd be bringing Jake home, and apparently they didn't trust her to deposit him and leave. When she pulled in beside the SUV, Jake cleared his throat. "You can just drop me off." "I don't intend to do that, Jake." "Why not?" "Because if I drop you off and drive away, it'll look like I turned tail and ran away from those two werewolves. I realize I'm not supposed to know they're werewolves, but I do, and I don't want them to think I was intimidated by them." "Does it matter what they think?" She glanced at him. "It does to me. At this point I represent my fellow humans. I'm an emissary for my species." "All right then. Let's go over and say hello." He opened the passenger door, picked up his duffel and stepped down. "Fine." She climbed down from the driver's side. She hadn't been expecting to meet the hunters when she brought Jake back around the lake, so she hadn't taken much time with her appearance. But as she walked around the front of her truck toward their vehicle, she reminded herself that she was an internationally recognized artist. Collectors from all over the world, including a few werewolves according to Jake, gladly paid high sums to have her work in their homes and office buildings. She didn't know what the hunters had going for them, but she refused to let them treat her like some riffraff that the heir to the hunter throne had been dallying with. Jake loved her, even if he might not ever admit that to them. Maybe he shouldn't, come to think of it. She was still a little worried about the dungeon and the maggot-infested crusts of bread. The hunters, who were apparently gifted with good manners, got out of their SUV to greet Rachel and Jake. They both wore designer sunglasses and smiled. At Jake first and Rachel second, but that wasn't so surprising. She knew Jake better. They had history. Bruce was more reserved. He shook hands with Jake without smiling and nodded in Rachel's direction. Bruce telegraphed brisk efficiency as if he hoped they could dispense with the pleasantries and get this show on the road. Rachel wasn't inclined to indulge him in that. "We didn't have much time to chat yesterday," she said, directing her conversation mostly to Anne. "But I'm thrilled that he's hooked up with family again. I'm sure he's missed that." "His family has missed him too," Anne said. "Having him back in Idaho will be wonderful." Easy for her to say, Rachel thought. "I'm sure it will be. Having him leave Polecat would be quite a bit less than wonderful, but that was her problem." "We should probably get in there and start packing," Bruce said in an ill-disguised attempt to move Rachel along. Rachel chose to let herself be moved. "Yep, don't want to hold you up." She had no interest in a prolonged visit with these two anyway. "I should be going anyway. I have an important project to finish, so it's time I got to work." She glanced at Jake and her heart constricted. His jaw was clenched as if anticipating a blow. She understood the feeling. She stepped closer to him. He'd worn his sunglasses so she couldn't see his eyes. "Might be just as well. Take care of yourself," she said softly. His voice was husky. "You too." She turned and fled. Hearing the grief reflected in those two words nearly destroyed her. Somehow she got her truck started. By some miracle nobody was on the road because she backed onto it without looking and peeled out. She didn't remember the drive back around the lake, but somehow she pulled into the parking spot beside the path leading to her cabin. Leaving her truck, she hurried down the path, fighting tears all the way. She didn't dare break down. Lionel would show up in less than 30 minutes, and she instinctively knew that if she let go, she'd still be crying when he arrived. "I love you, Rachel." The words brought her to a screeching halt. She looked around, almost expecting to see Jake. But of course he wasn't here. He was at his cabin with Anne and Bruce. Yet he'd sent her a message with the words he hadn't been able to say before. She'd left. Taking a calming breath, she focused all her attention on him and returned the favor. "I love you, Jake." Warmth enveloped her, as if he'd mentally wrapped his arms around her. She knew that in his mind he had. Then he sent one more word winging over the lake. "Always." She concentrated on him with all her might. "Yes, my love. Always." And that would have to sustain her. Walking toward her cabin, she vowed that it would. She hadn't locked up because she'd known she was coming right back. She opened the front door. She thought about the breakfast dishes waiting for her. She might not be able to face them without breaking down. So she'd leave them. Might as well walk straight out the back door and over to her shop. Work would help. It always did. She'd taken 2 steps in that direction when she heard a soft noise behind her. And something didn't smell right either. Maybe she was developing sensitivities. She started to turn around, but before she could, someone grabbed her from behind. She would have screamed, but a hand holding an acrid-smelling cloth covered her nose and mouth with a grip like iron. She struggled for only a second before everything went black. Chapter 23. Anne and Bruce had come armed with packing boxes and offered to tackle that job. Jake hadn't moved in years, so he gladly turned the chore over to them. He was about to call a local real estate agent about selling the cabin when he had the strangest feeling, as if his contact with Rachel had been abruptly cut off. Although she hadn't sent him any more messages after her last one, he'd still sensed a connection humming between them. Now there was nothing, as if the line had gone dead. Well, maybe that's the way she wanted it, because her dramatic exit had meant they'd left important words unsaid. He'd sent them to her telepathically. When she'd returned his message, his heartache had eased a little. Hers might have too. If so, she'd probably retreated to gather her forces. Maybe she'd gone out to her shop and immersed herself in her work. He could picture her doing that. If plunging back into normal life helped her, then he didn't want to interfere with that. In fact, he might as well do the same. He made his call to the real estate agent, who arranged to come right out with the necessary papers. Considering how long Jake had lived in Polecat, he was surprised at how quickly his connection to the community could be severed. A couple of phone calls to the utilities took care of that. Once the real estate agent arrived, and he'd signed the listing papers, he'd be cut loose from his former home. The way Anne and Bruce were working, they'd have him packed up in no time. They'd convinced him to leave everything except his clothes and his food. They'd even talked him out of taking any of his books. While both of them were busy in the kitchen sorting through the cupboards, he glanced over the books and decided they were right about leaving them. He'd read all the paperbacks and didn't plan to read them again. He wouldn't need Alaskan hiking trail information anymore. And now was the time to jettison Alaskan artisans of today. He should take Rachel's note out, though. He didn't want some stranger to find it and sell it on eBay. But the note wasn't there. He riffled through the pages, thinking he might have tucked it in a different section. Finally, he turned the book upside down and shook it. No note. Okay, that was strange. Or maybe not. He thought of all the snooping Rachel had done prior to him coming home from San Francisco. She'd probably noticed this book. If she'd opened it and found her note, she might have taken it out, planning to ask him about it eventually. With all they'd had going on, it was no wonder she'd forgotten the note. Come to think of it, she still had his favorite t-shirt too. He'd noticed it draped over one of her dining chairs this morning and had meant to stuff it in the plastic bag with the other dirty clothes. But their discussion during breakfast had become awkward and she'd been eager to get him out of there. He hadn't remembered to grab the shirt. If you're considering taking that book, I would advise against it. Jake glanced up to discover Bruce gazing at him from the kitchen doorway. It's an expensive book. Jake hadn't planned to take it, but he didn't care for Bruce's commanding tone. Besides that, it would be a good souvenir of my life here. It has Rachel Miller in it. You'd be better off leaving it here. That might be a true statement, but something about it bothered Jake. Finally, he figured out what it was. How do you know Rachel's in here? Bruce's gaze shifted. Not much, but enough to give him away. It was a good guess, judging from the title. I don't think you were guessing, Bruce. The older were shrugged. Okay, I looked at it. When? Although Jake had been on the phone for the past half hour, he'd been right here in the living room. Until a few minutes ago he'd thought Rachel's note was still in the book. Because of that note, he certainly would have noticed if Bruce had pulled the book off the shelf. Bruce waved his hand dismissively. I couldn't tell you exactly, but I looked at it and saw she was in it. If you take it with you, that's waving a red flag. Don't do it. Anyway, and wants to throw away all the meat in the freezer. She sent me out to make sure you're okay with that. I don't care about the meat in the freezer, Jake said quietly. But I do. Care that you and came in and went through my stuff when I wasn't home. Bruce flushed. Don't make accusations without proof, Jake. Your parents taught you better than that. Oh, but I have proof. Jake hefted the book in both hands. This book is special to me. If you'd picked it up while I was here, I would have been very aware that you had looked at it. Now Jake wondered if Bruce had taken the note, but it wasn't the main issue. No, there was something else going on, something that worried him far more than knowing the hunters had searched his cabin. They would have had multiple opportunities to do that because once again he hadn't bothered to lock up. He just wasn't in the habit. Then again, it might not have mattered if he'd locked the doors or not. They were determined enough, they would have found a way to get in. Jake had never worried about tight security in this cabin. He gazed at Bruce. Maybe you should have a seat. In fact, I think it needs to come in here and sit down too. The worst blue eyes narrowed and his tone turned icy. How dare you give me orders? I've been asked to be your alpha, Bruce, and life doesn't go well for those who lied to the alpha. I haven't lied to you. Okay, you aren't telling me the whole truth, which is pretty much the same thing. Unless you intend to overpower me and drag me to Idaho, which I can assure you isn't going to happen. I'm staying put until you tell me what's going on. Bruce turned his head. And we have a problem. You'd better come on in here so we can straighten it out. And walked out of the kitchen, a paper towel in her hand. What's the matter? I'd like you and Bruce to sit down. Jake gestured to the sofa. We need to talk. He says we're not telling him everything, Bruce said. Oh, and walked over to the sofa and settled down with a calm expression on her aristocratic features, but she balled the paper towel into a tight wad the size of a golf ball. What do you want to know, Jake? Jake waited for Bruce to take a seat next to his mate. At last he did. Although he frowned at Jake as he did so, Jake moved to the easy chair, sat down, and looked at these two wers who had been family friends for longer than he'd been alive. Yet he couldn't shake the idea they'd betrayed him. He took a deep breath. Let's start with the alpha position. Is there one? After all. Yes. And tightened her grip on the balled-up paper towel. Keegan really wants to step down. But there must be other candidates who are already living in Idaho. Why come all the way to Alaska to get me? The Hunter Pack has been impressed with your efforts with Warm, Bruce said. We admire the leadership qualities you've displayed. You're intelligent and even-tempered. At least that's what I thought until 5 minutes ago when you started acting crazy and throwing accusations around. Jake sighed. He should have known the setup was too good to be true. But somebody's mighty worried about my relationship with Rachel Miller, aren't they? And swallowed. There have been some concerns. Her signature wolf looks exactly like you, Jake. No, it looks exactly like my father, but that's neither here nor there. He decided to make a guess and see how they reacted. How long has the Hunter Pack had me under surveillance? It's not just the Hunter Pack, Anne said. Then she gasped and looked at Bruce. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. No, but he was going to find out anyway. Bruce looked at Jake. No matter which wolf Rachel Miller has been carving over and over, you can't deny that. You've acted with increasing recklessness when it comes to her. No, I can't deny it. Some of Jake's righteous indignation seeped away. So, this is a rescue mission then? Bruce nodded. We need a pack alpha, and the consortium thinks you should leave the area. You've made excellent progress with Warm, but you're putting those efforts in jeopardy. We need you in Idaho, and you'd be out of harm's way. It's a nice little 2-for-1 deal. It was a long speech, but Jake latched on to one particular word in it. Consortium. A like-minded group of wers that keeps an eye on potential breaches of security and quietly takes care of any we find. Breaches. The word sent icicles of fear into Jake's heart. What makes you think there's been a security breach? Bruce gazed at him. The consortium is thorough, Jake. We have documentation. Shit. Suddenly Rachel's worst-case scenario didn't look so paranoid. But Where council knows about this consortium, right? You're acting under its direction. Well, no, Jake, because they would want to regulate us and tie our hands. We're far more effective operating under the radar. A chill went down Jake's spine. Sorry, but I can't go along with that kind of behavior. I'm no big fan of the Were Council or WoW, but at least they operate out in the open. Bruce eyed him with irritating smugness. Doesn't matter whether you approve of us or not. You won't report us to the council or anyone. Watch me. Jake stood and pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. He still had Howard Wallace in his list of contacts. Jake, that's a really bad idea, and said. Don't think I care about the Hunter Alpha position. I don't give a rip about that anymore. I have bigger fish to fry. This consortium is dangerous and I intend to see that it's exposed. What about your precious Worm? Bruce's tone was mild, but his eyes glittered with malice. You not only had a sexual relationship with a human you created a security breach in the process. If that gets out, Worm will be finished. Duncan McDowell will dance on its grave. Jake longed to punch Bruce in the face, but the war had him by the short hairs. They exchanged malevolent stares. You're a real bastard, Jake said. And you're a real traitor to the cause. Tell me, are you prepared for the entire war community to know how you've betrayed them with Rachel Miller? Jake's stomach churned. Duncan McDowell would dance on Worm's grave if that came out. All that Jake had worked for would be down the drain. Once he was branded a hypocrite, anyone on the fence probably would go over to McDowell's camp. At least Duncan stuck to his beliefs. By giving in to his desire for Rachel, Jake had paved the way for others to do the same, assuming Bruce made good on his promise to reveal the relationship. But Bruce had something to lose too. You won't expose me, Jake said. If I go down, that weakens your campaign to keep wers and humans apart. We both lose. I'm counting on your intelligence and dedication to the cause, Jake. Work with me. Work with the consortium. Worm will be the public face of the movement and the consortium will be the private enforcer. Sounds like a bargain with the devil to me. Do you have a choice? Jake looked into his cold blue eyes. Oh yeah, I always have a choice. He couldn't work with this were. He knew that, and yet the alternative made him sick. He had to get out of here, away from these toxic people. I'm going for a drive around the lake. I'd advise you not to go over to Rachel's, Bruce said. Jake gazed at him. Yeah? Well, Bruce, you can take that advice and shove it where the sun don't shine. One more visit to Rachel isn't going to make this any worse than it already is, and she happens to help me think straight. Besides, I need to satisfy myself that she's fine. Checking to make sure his truck keys were in his pocket, he walked out the door. All the way around the lake, he realized he was running to a human to help him solve what was essentially a werewolf problem. That wasn't logical, and yet he trusted Rachel and wanted to make sure she was okay. He no longer trusted Anne and Bruce Hunter to guarantee that. And he definitely didn't trust this consortium they'd hooked up with. He'd assured Rachel that the Hunters weren't activists, and apparently they weren't in the normal sense. They didn't join organizations like Worm or Howl, the one Kate Stillman had founded as an acronym for honoring our werewolf legacy. No, the Hunters had decided to go underground and create some shadow group that didn't answer to anyone but themselves. The concept made Jake shudder. He shouldn't be surprised that the debate over human and where interaction should spawn a fringe group like this. The climate was ripe for it, and he'd fallen right into their hands. They'd probably been monitoring his movements for at least a year or more. Soon after Rachel's carvings became world famous, Jake had known some wers had suspicions about his potential involvement with Rachel, but he'd never dreamed that an ultra-conservative group was spying on him to gather evidence of a breach. If so, they had all the ammunition they needed to bring him to his knees. They'd probably recorded his nightly runs over to her cabin. They'd have the bear attack on tape, and once he'd entered her house as a wolf, the plan to remove him from Alaska had begun. He'd been naive enough to think that the Hunter's request was simple. The pack needed a new alpha and he was a good candidate. He'd been flattered and unwilling to look a gift horse in the mouth, but now he could see that hauling his ass all the way from Alaska was an extreme solution to their alpha issue. There had been more to it, much more. When he pulled into the parking area beside the path to Rachel's cabin, the presence of both Rachel's and Lionel's trucks calmed him. These were sincere, good people. Yes, Lionel had put a bullet in his shoulder, but he'd done it out of loyalty to Rachel. The kid would lay down his life for her, and Jake treasured that, even if it had caused him pain. Because he expected them both to be working, he headed straight for the workshop. But instead of an atmosphere of creativity and good cheer, he found Lionel sitting alone on a stool, staring into space. Rachel was nowhere around. Maybe she'd gone to the cabin for a cup of coffee. Lionel looked startled when Jake walked through the door. What are you doing here? I wanted to talk to Rachel. There's been a problem. I wanted to talk to her about it. Lionel stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. She's not with you? No, of course not. We agreed that I'd go to Idaho to be with my extended family and she'd stay here. That's not what her note says. What note? This one. Lionel picked it up from the workbench and handed it to Jake. I've read it about 100 times, and I still don't believe it. She wouldn't leave without seeing me. Jake scanned the note. Dear Lionel, I've decided to leave with Jake when he heads to Idaho to be with his family. I'm starting a new life there, so I've decided to be wild and crazy and leave everything here instead of going through the hassle of packing. I know this will shock you, but I want to leave the house, the workshop, and all the tools to you. The triptych is almost finished, so I'm sure you can add the final touches and deliver it to the client. After that, the sky's the limit. Walk in my footsteps, dear friend. Warmly, Rachel. Jake reread the note as he tried to figure out what the hell was going on. But she's not going to Idaho, he said. That was never the plan. But it's her handwriting, Lionel said. I've seen it a bunch of times and she wrote that. I'd swear to it. All I can tell you, Lionel, is that she wasn't planning to go to Idaho with me. And it's not like she showed up over at my place and announced she was doing that. She wouldn't have. Not considering everything. You know that better than I do, Mr. Hunter. But she's not here. So you've been all through the house? In his desperation, Jake prayed that she was still inside her cabin, maybe in the bathroom. Lionel wouldn't have opened that door to check on her. I've searched everywhere, Lionel said. Even the bathroom. That killed Jake's hope that she was in there. It's like she said. Lionel gestured around the shop. She left without taking anything. He turned to something lying in a heap on the workbench. She left dirty dishes in the sink, and this draped over a chair. He held up Jake's wolf t-shirt. A sense of dread settled in the pit of Jake's stomach. Something's very wrong about this. Well, duh, I know that. But what about her note? Why did she write something like that? Jake studied the note. After 3 years of looking at Rachel's thank you note. To him, he knew her handwriting well. First glance, this looked exactly like it, but there were subtle differences. The loops weren't quite as open, and the pressure on the paper wasn't quite as deliberate. Rachel wrote with an artist's flourish, and this handwriting was more controlled, more tentative. The longer Jake looked at this note, the more he became certain that someone, probably whoever had swiped her note out of his coffee table book, had forged her handwriting. His money was on the Hunters or someone connected to this consortium they'd hooked up with. He gazed at Lionel. This note makes no sense because she didn't write it. Lionel sucked in a breath. Then who did? The same ones who made her disappear. Oh God, then she's been kidnapped? Or kidnapped? Jake wouldn't let himself think of the alternative. Although his heart pounded frantically, he had to keep his mind clear, for Rachel's sake. Yes, I think she's been kidnapped. Then I'm calling the cops. Lionel pulled out his cell phone. Wait. Jake had a good idea who had taken her, and calling the human police might do no good whatsoever. He laid a hand on Lionel's arm. Let me try something else first. What? Don't laugh, but Rachel and I have a psychic connection. I'm not laughing. I believe in psychic connections, Mr. Hunter. Can you tune her in? I'm going to try. Dear God, please let it work. Then he remembered how the connection between them had seemed to go dead about an hour ago, and his blood ran cold. If anything had happened to her, he would have no reason to live. No, that wasn't true. He'd have a reason, finding those who'd harmed her and making them pay. If you get a bead on her, we're going after her, Lionel said. You and me. Absolutely, Lionel. Panic clawed at Jake's insides, but he refused to give into it. She was alive. She had to be. And her fate could well depend on his ability to handle this. He briefly thought of going back and forcing the Hunters to tell him what they knew, but they might not have details of the plan and he'd only waste valuable time trying to get the information out of them. Connecting directly to Rachel would be faster. If he couldn't do that, then he'd confront Ann and Bruce. But either way, he would find her. She was everything to him, and he finally knew that. Chapter 24. Rachel tried to fight free of the dreamlike fog that enveloped her so she could think. She had an urgent need to think, but she wasn't sure why that was, and her brain wasn't working right. She's coming out of it. Rachel didn't recognize the voice. Was she in a hospital? Had she crashed on the road between Jake's cabin and hers? No, she remembered arriving at her place, parking her truck and walking into the house. Should we put her under again? A different voice, although both were male. Nah, that'll just make hauling her around tougher. Good point. Rachel listened to the conversation with growing alarm. These men, whoever they were, didn't have her best interests at heart if they referred to her as piece of luggage. Hauling her around. Good grief. Gradually she figured out she was in the back seat of a vehicle, some sort of SUV. Her captors, and she was reasonably sure that was the right term for the two men in front, were taking her somewhere, but why? For ransom? She supposed that her parents would pay to get her back, but her net worth was greater than theirs. A smart person would kidnap her parents and make her pay up. Maybe she was in the hands of idiots, never a good thing. Well, it could be good thing. If she could outsmart them, she could get away. She went back over the events that had led to this situation to try and make sense of it. She'd left Jake's cabin in quite an emotional state. Then as she'd walked down the path to her place, she'd felt that psychic connection with him. They'd reaffirmed their love for each other. So far so good. On the way into her house, she'd decided to go straight out to the workshop and use her art to soothe her raw emotions. But she hadn't done that because someone, one of these two thugs in the front, no doubt, had grabbed her and knocked her out with a nasty-smelling hanky. While she was unconscious, they'd put her in this vehicle and driven away from her cabin. Although she wasn't happy with her next conclusion, she admitted this probably had something to do with werewolves who didn't trust her as much as Jake did. Shit. If that was the case, she needed to gather information before they threw her in the maggot-infested dungeon she'd imagined. Anyone who'd watched movies that featured dungeons knew that once the iron door slammed, you got zero information. Your keepers were sadistic cretins who spoke in monosyllables and enjoyed watching you suffer. Your only friend would be the tiny spider in the corner of your cell. Sitting up a little straighter in the seat, she noted that they had not belted her in. She rectified that oversight. Her throat was dry, but she worked up enough spit to talk without sounding like Golem. Where are you taking me? That was the classic kidnap victim question from all the grade B movies, but she really wanted to know. It doesn't matter, said a brown-haired, beefy fellow in the passenger seat. Because you're going to kill me? She didn't think so, but it didn't hurt to ask. If they'd wanted to kill her, she'd be dead by now and her body would be in an unmarked grave. Oh no, said the driver, who was equally muscular but had reddish hair. You've got it made. You're headed for a penthouse in a Vancouver high-rise. Vancouver, BC? Are we driving all that way? Yes, ma'am, we are. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. His shades made him look quite forbidding. Carl and I will be trading off so we don't have to stop along the way. That's insane. It's a really long way. The driver shrugged. It's not so bad. He checked the time on his cell phone, tucked in a holder on the dash. We've already logged in almost an hour. With no complications, we could make it in late tomorrow night or early the next morning. Rachel wasn't about to spend 2 days with these goons, who were most certainly werewolves if they were cool with driving straight through to Vancouver. Nobody did that. But they'd have to let her get out of the car to use public restrooms during this marathon trip, and that's when she'd get away. Oh, and so you don't waste time dreaming up your escape, the brown-haired one named Carl said. You'll only be allowed to leave this car for one reason, and we brought a little camping potty along for that purpose. Mitch and I would catch hell if you climbed out a bathroom window and got away. Damn, so she hadn't been captured by idiots after all. That would make escape more difficult, but she'd be watching for every opportunity. But in the meantime, she'd pretend that she'd accepted her fate, so they might relax their vigilance. So what happens once you deliver me to this penthouse? You live in the lap of luxury, that's what, Carl said. Great view, terrific food, luxurious surroundings. What's the catch? The usual thing. You can never leave. Panic threatened to close her throat and make her choke. She couldn't be confined like that. Maybe someone, a Howard Hughes type, would be thrilled with such a setup, but she might as well be dead. As a prisoner in a penthouse, she wouldn't be able to work. She'd be cut off from her family and friends. She'd have life but nothing worth living for. Considering that, she might as well be in a dungeon where she was fed maggot-infested bread. But she wouldn't end up in this penthouse. By now Lionel would have come over and found her missing. He'd sound the alarm. Maybe not right away because he might think she was over at Jake's, but eventually he'd try to find out where she was. She cleared her throat. You realize that people will come looking for me. Have friends and family. I have wealthy clients. They'll try to find me. This isn't going to work the way you think it will. Yeah, it will, said Mitch the driver. It seems you left a note saying you were headed off to Idaho and a new life with Jake Hunter. You turned your place and your workshop over to Lionel. What note? I didn't write a note. No, but the note is in your handwriting, Carl said. Mitch glanced at his traveling companion. I'm not sure you should be telling her all that, especially after the phone call we got a little while ago regarding you-know-who. Look, the note bought us time. All we needed was a chance to get the hell out of Dodge. I guess we have a head start. You and I are the only ones who were told the ultimate destination, so we're golden. Carl turned toward the back seat. Your future is in Vancouver, sweetheart. Just accept that and move on. Rachel wasn't accepting a damn thing, but fighting with Carl and Mitch would waste precious energy. She was beginning to get the picture now. The Hunters were more than emissaries who wanted to recruit Jake as their new alpha. That might have been one of their goals, but the other was getting her out of the way. The sample of her handwriting had probably been her original note to Jake. The Hunters had gotten hold of it somehow. Then she had a horrible thought, the worst one yet. Had Jake known about this plan? No, surely not. She couldn't believe that he would have agreed to it. If he'd betrayed her so completely, then he wouldn't have. She refused to think he was capable of such treachery. And if he hadn't known about this, then it was time she told him. Naturally, the werewolves had taken away her cell phone, but she had a secret weapon, one they wouldn't even know she was using. You might think I've gone off the deep end, Jake said to Lionel, but I'm going to. Listen, if you have to take your clothes off for this, then okay, but I'll have to leave while you do that. No, I'm not planning to get naked. Good. Lionel pushed his hair off his forehead. That's a relief, Mr. Hunter. I'm going into the cabin to get that wolf carving off her mantle. Oh yeah. Lionel followed him out of the workshop. You mean the carving you ditched? I thought that was the craziest move I'd ever heard of. Do you know what that thing is probably worth? If touching it focuses my thoughts on her, and we can connect easier, then it's priceless. You have a point there. Jake took the steps to her deck two at a time. Ever since deciding to connect with her, he'd been trying to get the same sense he'd had earlier this morning when they'd sent their thoughts to each other with such perfect clarity. He was relieved that something seemed to be happening now. When he thought of her, he didn't get the feeling of dead air between them, thank God. But he was picking up a lot of static. Thinking the piece of wood might make a difference was possibly both corny and wrong, but he felt the urge to do it, and under the circumstances he was going with his gut. The carving had been their first link. Maybe it would come through for him now and cut through that static. Inside the cabin, he made himself ignore all the things that threatened to get him choked up, like the untidy kitchen he could see by looking through the pocket door. He'd been an ass this morning, raving on about werewolf superiority, but he couldn't let himself be swamped with regret right now. He had a job to do. Taking the carving from the mantel, he sat down on her sofa and put it in his lap. Instantly he felt closer to her, as he had all those times when he'd stood beside his own mantel and gazed at her work. She's a great artist. Lionel settled himself in an easy chair next to the sofa. Nobody carves wolves the way she does. She has a gift, all right. Jake looked over at him. I don't know how long this will take. You don't have to sit here unless you. I'll sit here. Lionel's dark gaze was troubled. The minute you figure out where she is, we're leaving. That's if I find out. You will. You have to. Jake looked at the kid, whose every muscle was tense with worry. I know. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes and spread his hands over the remembered grooves of the wolf carving. Rachel, where are you? At first he got nothing except a fuzzy transmission that could have been his own thoughts ricocheting around in his brain. He was easily as tense as Lionel. He forced himself to relax and try again. Rachel, where are you? Jake. I'm in an SUV. He sucked in a breath. Where? Alaskan highway going south. The bastards had taken her. He gripped the wood. How long? About 50 minutes. Color? Black. Hang on, Rachel. We're coming. Watch for my truck. Hurry, Jake. I damn well will. Opening his eyes, he stood and laid the piece of wood on the sofa. Let's roll. Where is she? Jake filled him in as he headed for the front door. Should I bring my gun then? Lionel followed close behind. It's in my truck. I have ammunition. Jake debated for a second. He wasn't a fan of guns, especially the exact rifle. That had wounded him a short time ago. He would never shoot any creature. But tires, that was a different matter. Yeah, he said. Bring your gun. He walked out the front door with Lionel right behind him. How about my red emergency light? Your what? Jake had no idea what the kid was talking about, so he continued out the door and down the path to the parking area, moving fast. Just an old one, the bubblegum kind. Why do you have it in the first place? Oh, you know, something I picked up for fun to scare my friends. Lionel hurried to keep up. You can stick it on the top of your vehicle, and when you turn it on, at first glance you look like a cop. Isn't that illegal? Well, yeah, but you can get away with stuff like that out here. Not too many cops to catch you doing it. Me and my friends, we play tricks on each other all the time. Okay, that might come in handy. They reached the parking area and Jake started towards his truck. I have a siren too. Jake looked at him and shrugged. What the hell? Bring everything. He didn't know how this would all shake out, but he'd use whatever tools presented themselves. An emergency light and a siren might be just what he needed as a distraction. Moments later, they were heading toward the highway, going way over the speed limit. Lionel glanced over at the speedometer. See, here's my thought. If we put the bubble light on top, we can fool anybody on the road into thinking we have a right to speed. Except a cop. Which is why I brought my fuzzbuster. Lionel stuck it on the dash. And my converter plug so we can run everything. Good Lord. Jake kept his eyes on the road because he really was going way too fast, but with all of Lionel's paraphernalia, they might get away with racing along like maniacs. Fortunately, the SUV they were pursuing would be driving at a very sedate pace. Whoever was in the car with Rachel wouldn't want to be pulled over with a kidnap victim on board. But by the time Jake finished with them, they might wish it had been the cops who pulled them over. As they raced along, Jake tried not to worry about Lionel hanging out the window while he used his long arms to slap the bubble light on the roof of the cab. Don't fall out, okay? Hey, this is nothing. You should see me doing it while I'm driving. No thanks. That was the moment Jake realized he would have to work hard not to be an overprotective father when the time came. Maybe Rachel could help him with that and remind him that all kids, werewolf and human alike, needed space to grow. Lionel got the light working and Jake took full advantage of the fact that cars pulled over to let him by. The emergency light was a brilliant concept. They were making excellent time. Want me to crank up the siren, Mr. Hunter? Jake glanced over at him and recognized the light of battle in the kid's eyes. Sure. Let's give him all we've got. Awesome. Lionel added the siren to the mix, and cars pulled over even quicker. Jake slammed the pedal down, turned the big V8 loose, and the truck screamed down the highway. Apparently luck was smiling on them because they didn't pass a single cop car as they hurtled along. Jake factored in the speed of the SUV compared with his speed, and when he thought they might be getting close, he told Lionel to keep an eye out for a black SUV. We might see more than one, you know, Lionel said. I guess. Jake thought about that. But I have a feeling I'm going to know it when we see it. He couldn't explain the emotion burning in his chest, but the closer he got to Rachel, the hotter the flame. Those bastards had Rachel, and they were going to rue the day they were born. Chapter 25. From the moment Rachel had made telepathic contact with Jake, she'd had trouble sitting still. She knew he was coming for her. She could feel it. She almost felt sorry for the two werewolves in the front seat. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Their pursuer had faced down a grizzly to keep her safe. Taking on a couple of thugs like them would be a piece of cake. When she heard the siren and turned to see the flashing light on the top of Jake's black truck, she had to clap her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing and shouting for joy. Now this was what she called a rescue. Mitch glanced in his side view mirror. What the fuck is that idiot doing? He's coming for you, Rachel thought with barely controlled glee. Be afraid. Be very afraid. Just pull over and let him go by, Carl said. He's probably drunk. Yeah, probably is, Mitch said. These backcountry types love to tie one on. Don't they? He swung the SUV to the side of the road. Go around, idiot. The black truck didn't go around. Instead it pulled up behind the SUV, its big engine rumbling. The siren stopped screeching and the emergency light switched off. Mitch, Carl said in a low voice. I think you'd be wise to get the hell out of here. I smell a we're in that truck. When you're right, you're right. Mitch gunned it, but the SUV didn't get very far. 2 shots rang out. Mitch started swearing as the car swerved, its 2 rear tires blown out. Mitch pulled the SUV to the shoulder and looked over at Carl. You ready to fight Jake Hunter? Was that in the contract? Not the one I read. Rachel unlatched her seatbelt and turned to watch Jake and Lionel get out of the truck. Maybe it was her imagination, but they seemed to radiate power as they approached the SUV like a couple of gunslingers from the Old West. Carl turned to look too. One's human. Yeah, and he's carrying a rifle. That's not good. You armed, Mitch? Not me. How about you, Carl? You know I hate the things. Mitch sighed. Then how about we give them the woman and call a towing service? That's not going to make us very popular. Mitch glanced in the side view mirror one more time. Hey, their plan didn't work. Is that our fault? You know the rap sheet on Hunter. He challenged it. Grizz not long ago. And won. Personally, I don't care to tangle with him. Me either. Carl unsnapped his seatbelt and opened his door. Hey, don't shoot. You can have her. We surrender. As Rachel scrambled out of the car, she realized 2 things. All wers weren't as courageous as Jake, and from this moment on, he'd have to pry her away from his side with a crowbar. Whether he wanted her or not, she was his forever. Put your hands over your heads, Lionel shouted, pointing his rifle alternately at Mitch and Carl. This gun's loaded, and I wouldn't hesitate to shoot you. I can testify to that, Jake said. Come on over here, Rachel. She didn't have to be asked twice. Running to him, she accepted the protection of being tucked firmly against his side while he kept his attention on Mitch and Carl. Thank you, she murmured. Don't mention it. He held her so tight she wondered if he cut off the circulation in her arm, and he was trembling. He'd managed to intimidate the 2 werewolves who'd abducted her, but he was vibrating from the residual fear. For that matter, so was she. Even so, his voice was steady as he spoke to her captors. We'll leave with Rachel now. Want us to call a tow truck for you? We'll handle that, Mitch said. Your call. Jake took a deep breath. You might want to reconsider your choice of friends. Trust me, Carl said. I'm already doing that. Good. Come on, Rachel. We're done here. Lionel kept his rifle at the ready. You 2 get in the truck. I'll keep these 2 covered until you beep the horn. Thanks, Lionel. Jake gave Rachel a squeeze. Let's go home. Do you mean that? He hustled her toward the truck. I do. In every sense of the word. I'm never leaving you again. Her heart soared. Maybe getting kidnapped wasn't such a bad thing if it could convince the love of her life that he belonged by her side. Once they were all in the cab with Rachel wedged between Lionel and Jake, Lionel was full of questions. I never did ask why somebody would take Rachel in the first place. I mean, who were those guys? They seemed to know who you were, Jake. Rachel decided to let Jake respond. Turns out there was a plot to hold Rachel for ransom, Jake said. I guess they thought that somebody, maybe her folks, would be able to access her bank account. Lionel considered that. I suppose that makes sense, but how did you figure that out, Jake? They decided to use me as part of the plot. See, I decided to move back to Idaho to be with my extended family, and the kidnappers made it look like Rachel had gone with me to throw everybody off until they were ready to make their demands. Rachel smiled to herself. It was a flimsy story, but it might pass muster with Lionel. She hoped so, because Lionel must never find out the truth. She didn't want him to carry the secret around for the rest of his life. So are you going to Idaho, Mr. Hunter? No, not anymore. I realized my life is here with Rachel. He reached over and laced his fingers through hers. She adored Lionel and was incredibly touched that he'd come along to help facilitate the rescue. But she had so much to say to Jake that couldn't be said. She'd have to wait until they were alone and hope she didn't explode from frustration in the meantime. The rest of the trip home was filled with a recap of the exciting chase and the satisfying ending. Lionel had obviously had the time of his life and could hardly wait to share his hero status with his friends and family. Rachel blessed that urge because when they pulled into the parking space near her cabin, Lionel was fidgeting in his eagerness to leave. "I'm really glad you're home safe, Miss M," he said as he stood with his gadgets piled in his arms. Jake held his rifle for him. "Lionel, I can't ever thank you enough for coming to my rescue." He beamed at her. "You had to know I would. Jake and we knew we'd get you back. It was a given." It was. Standing on tiptoe, she kissed Lionel on the cheek. "Now go party. You deserve it." He blushed. "Thanks. Oh, and Lionel, do you happen to know any women who might be interested in Ted Haggerty?" "Mr. Haggerty? He likes being single. He said so a bunch of times." "Well, he's not quite as happy as he wants us to think." Lionel nodded. "All right then. I'll see what I can do. See you in the morning." "Okay. You bet." Rachel gazed at him with fondness. "By the way, is your carving in the wood shop?" "Oh yeah, I left it there. We can talk about it tomorrow. I may pay it a visit before then." You don't have to do that, Miss M. You and Mr. Hunter probably need, well, you know." Jake wrapped an arm around Rachel. "We can take time to look at your art." "Lionel." Rachel didn't think she could love Jake anymore, but that comment made her full to the bursting point. "Well, see you two later." Lionel dumped his gadgets in the passenger seat, took the rifle from Jake and climbed into his truck. With a wave he drove away. Rachel sighed and leaned her head against Jake's shoulder. "Oh my God." "Yeah." He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "Let's go see Lionel's carving. If we don't do it now, we'll forget." Tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "Okay." No one else had understood the dream she had for Lionel, but Jake did. After a short walk through the midday sun, they stood in the workshop, arms wrapped around each other as they gazed at the piece of wood that she'd given Lionel to carve. She'd wondered if Lionel would choose to carve wolves because she did. But no. He'd wisely decided to take a different path. In his carving, a majestic eagle soared over a rugged mountain range. The rush of freedom he'd caught in the eagle's flight took her breath away. "It's good," Jake said. "It is." She tightened her hold on him. "Very good. He's going to make it as an artist." Jake was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad I'll be here to see it happen." She gazed up at him, so afraid that his choice would be painful for him, at least in the beginning. "Will you become a pariah because of me?" He gazed down at her, love shining in his eyes. "Even if I did, I wouldn't give a damn. But I won't. If there's one thing werewolves understand, it's the importance of finding a soulmate. I'll have to eat some crow when I admit that my soulmate turned out to be you, a human female, and Worm will take a big hit. I hate that. It was your baby." "I know, but thanks to this humbling experience with you, I realized the concept was too limiting. I have to expand my thinking, and there will be those who criticize me for waffling, but it's a small price to pay for being able to love you for the rest of my life." "What about the Hunters?" A shadow crossed his features. "I'll have to deal with them, no question. They've hooked up with some fringe group called the Consortium, and I'll have to report that to the Work Council." "Jake, I'm afraid I've made your life more complicated." He laughed in that low, intimate way she loved. "Of course you have. I'll have hell to pay, and McDowell will be insufferable. But you're worth it." Still holding her, he turned so that they were face to face. "I humbly ask you, Rachel Miller, if you will consent to be my mate." She looked into those green eyes, knowing that they were the eyes of a creature she only partly understood. But she knew his heart, and it belonged to her. "Yes," she said. "I will be your mate, Jake Hunter. You don't want to think about it? Ever since you suggested that as a solution to our problems, I've thought of nothing else." She smiled up at him. "I think I knew the answer then. Yet, Jake, yes, yes, and forever after yes."